with the vast proportion of architectural modelling complete, I'm going to move on to modelling some more detail around the facade, and particularly articulation around some of these bedroom glazing or some of these bedroom windows. What I'm going to do is, referencing the example image, I'm going to essentially depress the facade around the windows just to add some articulation. This is really just a stylistic thing that I'm doing. You can choose to do that if you wish, or you don't have to. I'm just sort of showing you what is possible in this regard. So I'm going to turn off my topography. It's such a massive component of the model, we just don't need it. And I'm going to go to my walls layer. So I'll turn off topography. And on my walls layer, I'm going to go to my solids. And I'm just going to draw a random box. I don't really care what size. I'm going to move it, turn off project, move it to the corner of the glazing. I'll move this down. This has to be taller than the whole building to get the effect that I'm after. Okay, and then I am going to turn on wireframe mode, and I'm going to use scale 1D, which we've used now before. And I'm going to go from this point here across to the intersection. So to the width of the box, click, second time, and then the third time I'm going to bring it back to the width of the window. It's the quickest way to get this to the same dimension as the glazing. Then what I'm going to do is, it's now butted up. We already know it's butted up against the facade, like so. And I'm just going to hit minus, say, 50. Or maybe minus 100. Bring that back a little bit more. Okay, so that's now done. And I might go back to my top view, change this to wireframe mode. And I'm just going to copy this across. Copy from center point of window to center point of window. So it's in the same place every time. All right, so now we're good to Boolean difference that. So we have Boolean difference. I select my external walls because it's the walls I want to remove, not the glazing itself. I'm going to move the glazing. And then I click spacebar, click the 4 inputs, and there we go again. Okay, all done. Now the windows I can move backwards as well because they're currently forwards. So I'm going to move them back minus 100. And that's now complete. Excellent, that looks good. And then if I'm to turn this into shaded mode, you'll see now you've got those depressions in the facade. All right, and we can materialize those differently. And once we get start putting glass or start materializing these blocks, it will sort of really come together along with the topography as well. Materials in Rhino is a massive topic. You could potentially do an entire term course or even semester-long course around materials, material properties, rendering properties, lighting and camera and rendering settings. It is an entire industry within itself. We're going to utilize materials in the most expedient way to get a really solid result in a really quick succession of time. At the end of this course, at the end of the Rhino assignment, you're going to understand, a workflow to get out renders that are, every bit as good as anything that you're going to submit to town planning, that will exceed anything that you're going to need to send to a client for a quick sketch, but will be short of, say, advertising or promotional rendering, which is usually done by an external rendering house in general. It's a different form of rendering too, compared to, say, a real-time rendering engine like Twinmotion or like, say, Unreal or something like that. This is sort of meant to be a little bit of a matte painting, suggestive type of rendering system. So the texture systems we're going to go through here are a little bit more simplistic in nature, but they still give a very strong result. If you're seeking more detail on materials, material properties, lighting and rendering within Rhino, there's a wealth of resources online that will direct you to that and describe that in detail, as well as very specific courses too. The other thing to keep in mind is that the material structure and your approach to materials varies depending on the rendering engine that you use. In our situation, what makes this workflow so good, and what I've seen this used, and this is the system that's used quite a lot in large architectural firms, is just because it's so quick. So Rhino has a real-time rendering engine, which is what happens when you click on rendered mode. So in this setup, you essentially get out just a white render, or what you'd call like a foam white render, and you can associate materials to this, and then essentially we export JPEG images out of this. So we use what would be called just ambient lighting and standard ambient occlusion. That's what gives these soft shadows around all the geometry. We're not using an actual rendering engine to then send out rays of light and then receive them and then diagnose or to produce or manufacture an image from that. This is a very quick way of doing it, because it means that you want to get a render out, just face it over here. You want to render over here, just turn around there, or just turn around here. And when you are working against the clock, for every one render that you might get out of a rendering software, or maybe taking a Revit model into Lumium or something like that, you could get out maybe 4 or 5 renders out of Rhino in this regard. So, but really, it's horses for courses, and across your qualification, you're going to be taught multiple different methods. And so this is just another string to the bow, and another arrow in your arsenal to use, or for what you prefer to use in industry. So as you note, the first thing I did is I changed this to rendered mode. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at some basic materials. So I'm going to start with our window blocks. I'm going to zoom in on our normal window. I'm going to double click on that to open up the block, which I have now. And when I click on any one of these components inside of the properties, you have the option to add a material, and then you have the option to map that material, map that texture. You also have the option to add a decal, and then a few other items as well. Now, decals is not something that we'll be learning in this class. What we generally learn is the method to apply a texture to objects, and then to use a bitmap to size them correctly, using a UVW map to size them correctly. So you can also apply materials to an entire layer. So where that is, we'll do it in some instances like typography, but usually when you have items on a layer, they tend to be different materials. So if you have a walls layer, you probably want different finishes on different walls. It would become very slow if you needed to have a new layer every time you had an object that was a different material on that layer. You'd end up with even in this model, you might end up with 6 different wall layers merely because there's a different finish on them, when geometrically they are the same category of object. So the method to texturize objects, personally, I believe works better. However, again, it is really just a preference-based workflow. So we have this now. I'm selecting some of the glazing, and the first thing to do is to go to our materials tab underneath our properties. So I'm in the properties. That's our normal properties, and then next to that it has the material. So at this point it says it's using the current layer material, and the current layer material is default. That's that white color that you're looking at. So I'm going to click on this little plus icon and say I want to use a new material, and I want to use a custom new material. Now you have all these options here: double-sided, an emission material like smoke or gases, whether it's a gem, whether it's glass, metal, etc. You might think that you would be using glass here, but it doesn't exactly give us the best result. Generally, the preset glass material works better when we actually render. So I stick with just a custom material. And so inside the materials tab, I can, firstly, let's rename it. So we'll call this one, and it always helps to have a prefix before it, so you know which materials are yours. This may not seem like a big deal right now, but when we start importing models from external parties, think about it like this. Maybe a coffee machine you might import. That coffee machine might have 16 different materials, and they're going to be a random name of materials. It's going to be like a bunch of numbers and letters jumbled up. It's going to be terrible. So you want some method to quickly filter out what materials are yours and what materials are from external parties. So I'm just going to use my initials at the start and then underscore, and then I'm going to go glazing. Okay, so that's now done. The type of material is custom. That's those presets we talked about. The color for glazing, I would recommend you going for black, and you can see straight away that this is updated to a black material. You can add gloss and reflectivity. That only makes sense if we're really rendering it, but to be honest, it's the transparency we want to change. So in here, I'm going to make it maybe 65 or maybe 60% transparent, thereabouts, and that's basically it for now. When we go to add textures, we'll add them in here, but that's basically it. So what I can do is I can click on these two glass panes, click on the drop down, and now I have PM underscore glazing. I can apply that to those. You can also make underneath the properties window. So let's say, for instance, I'm done with that. I'll close that block. Underneath the properties tab, across from that, I also have the rendering tab and I also have the materials tab. So the materials tab is basically what we just saw before, but it's like the full library of materials. So I can make new materials in here just by pressing on the plus icon, and I can then pick them from that drop down list. So it's almost as if they're already created and I just apply them to the objects. Either or, doesn't matter. So I can either create the materials first and then have them in the library and then pick them from the drop down box when I select on an object. You'll see when I click on this wall, for instance, it would then appear down here. Or essentially I can just click the drop down box and make them as I go. It's 6 of one, half dozen of the other. So with that in mind, let's go back to our block, and I'm going to double click on the block, and let's grab those frames now. So I'm going to grab these frames. I'm going to create another material. It's another custom material. I'm going to name it again PM underscore powder coating, something like that. And this will be a dark gray. It'll be a little bit darker than that. Something like that. Yep. And I'm also going to add a little bit of gloss to that and a little bit of reflectivity. Reflectivity might actually be much lower. That's basically all I need to do, just something like that. Okay, and you can see as I move my mouse around, you can sort of see that glossiness on the surface itself. Okay. In actual fact, I'm going to drag that right back down. I don't actually want that. I'm going to leave it as matte. Okay, and as you can probably hear in the background, as soon as you start working with materials, this is where the computer really starts ramping up. I highly, highly suggest to you that you model and work in shaded mode only, and only go to rendered mode when you're editing materials. So as soon as I click OK, notice the other blocks have already updated, and that's saved us a bunch of time. Also, if I want to change the material, that's going to be really quick, really expedient to do so. So let's move on to the walls. So these external walls, I don't know what material I'm going to make them yet, but let's find out. So I'm going to go material, custom, and because I don't know exactly what material I'm going to give it, I'm just going to go PM underscore facade for now, because I don't want to get locked into using concrete or using a timber or something like that. So I'm going to click on the color icon. The color drop down. I'm going to pick on this little arrow here and then go assign texture. And when that comes up, it comes up in my library of textures that I've previously used. And let's see what we've got here. I'm doing this on the fly. I have no idea what I'm going to use. Maybe these timber planks here, but there again, I'm not sure whether that's really what we want, but look, we'll give that a go. So I'll click on those planks and you can see how big the texture is currently. So no gloss, no reflectivity, don't need any of that. I've got my texture there. If I've got like a bump map, I could put that in there as well, though it's not going to do you a heck of a lot of good, because we're not rendering it. So you're not getting light from all angles and in different directions and with reflective and refractive lighting or anything like that. So you'll end up just slowing down your model for really no good reason. Okay, so now with that selected, I'm going to go to the next tab up here that's called texture mapping. So I have to have the object selected and the texture applied to it. And it comes up with this area here. So currently the type is a surface type of texture, and you can see there's all sorts of differences here. So you have underneath that, you have planar, UV. And remember that I alluded to before that these textures are using UVW maps. So it's not an XYZ, it's relevant to the surface. So UV is just X and Y, UVW is X, Y, and Z. Box, spherical, box both sides, cylindrical. There's like a bunch here. I'm going to use box. That's all I need to use. Now, straight away, the texture basically disappears, and it's probably because it's absolutely tiny. So you have a few different options here. You've got the XYZ position, you've got the rotation, and then you've got its size. So at the moment, I think this is how many times it's replicating. So if I lock that together, at the moment the XYZ is just that amount of times. But if I put in like 50, yeah, that's right. You can start to see the texture, and even still, it's absolutely tiny. So what happens if I make that 500? We start to see it a little bit more. What about 5,000? That's a little bit too big, but you can see how that's working. So maybe 2,500. Yep. And then let's see if we can rotate this. So we want to rotate this in the X direction. That's not really working. What about this direction? That does work. I won't lie. It will depend on the... It depends on the geometry orientation to begin with and what is X, Y, what rotation works and what doesn't. Most of the time, it is really just a case of experimentation and seeing what works. Same with here in terms of the size. I lock this so it's proportional. So so when you increase the size, it's increasing it in the UVW or the XYZ proportions. It's not just making it a longer texture; it's making it longer, wider, and taller. And then you have UVW repeats and rotation. So repeat is similar to that sort of system here, where I can say I want the texture to repeat 20 times, 30 times, 50 times, 200 times, whatever it may be. And then usually locking it is the smart play because, again, you want to move them relative to each other. So that's not a bad result. If I hit escape a couple times, we can start to see how that texture looks. And it's not a bad looking texture. That looks okay. Okay, that's fine. What I might do is let's create another texture. And what I will do is the other tip that that you can utilize is you can select faces and you can apply textures to different faces, and that's why that in the last tutorial I went through face selecting is so critical here. So the rule of thumb that I would give you is to start with texturizing the bulk of the object first. So what I mean by that is these indents in the facade, I want to materialize them in that same gray material that I use the windows for, but I've got way more surface that's going to be timber. So I'm going to start with the timber first. And same with the internal walls. The internal walls here, you can see as I zoom in, I don't want the bedrooms to be timber. I want them to be like a white plasterboard or just a white material. But the bulk of the outside is in that timber. So I'll make sure that's done first, and then what I'll do is I'll use Shift and Control and click that surface, and make sure I get the two indent surfaces. And when I do that, I can then give them another material. So in this case, I can say, all right, I want that to be the powder coating material. And now I've got two types of material on my facade, and you can see straight away how much more effective that breaking up the facade actually works. So I'll do that here. This is a little bit more tedious because there is really no quicker way to do it. And but the advantage to this is we are breaking up the material and keeping it as one object. This doesn't always work. So let's say, for instance, I want to select these two materials here, and I want to select that surface and this surface. And instead of making this just like a black powder coat, I wanted to give this another type of timber. If I do that, I can't change the UVW map, like its size and scale, its texture mapping, because it takes the parent object, which is the entire of the external walls. That is a little bit finicky. If that's the case, your two options are normally to either explode the walls so they become separate objects, and then you can texturize each thing individually, but then that will slow everything down a lot. Or the other thing would be to essentially model a very, very thin surface over the top of these and then change the texture on that object or that separate object that sits on top of the wall. And I don't know, make that object like 1 mil thick or 2 mil thick. Again, you can lie in these types of models because they're presentation models. They're not meant to be built off in this instance, at least not here. We're thinking of this as a schematic model. But if you're using just a solid color like this, then this system we're doing now is perfect for it. So let's finish off with this one here. Trying to make sure I get that face. There we go. And I'll make that the black powder coat. All right, so that looks pretty good. So I've got all this to go. I've still got a ton more to go. What I might do though, is I'm just gonna hide this and let's go to our polished concrete, and I'll do that one next. So I got my polished concrete floor selected, go to my materials, create a new material, custom, change my name, PM_concrete. And then under color, click the drop down, assign texture, and let's go seamless textures, concrete, and I'm going to choose one of these. Now, another tip for you. So when I do that, I get my concrete here, and that is absolutely ginormous, doesn't need to be that big. I'm going to go to my mapping, and let's go again, box. I'll lock this, and I'll repeat this pattern, I don't know, say 50 times. I can start to see the texture. There it is there. It's tiny. So again, 500, 5,000. Okay, that looks better. Excellent. That's starting to look a little bit more like polished concrete. In fact, I might make that just a little bit smaller again. So 3,000. Okay, that looks good. Now, all right, and I'll hit escape and I'm done. Now, I can see the repetitive nature of the texture. I can see the texture sort of sits somewhere around there. This is not really a problem if we set up our cameras right. So I'm not too worried if you can see a repetitive texture from, say, back here, when your image is going to be taken, something like this. You can't really tell the edges of the texture. If you can tell really badly, you can use your texture mapping and move the texture around. You can change its size, you can change its positioning. So if I go like this, I can click and then move. I can move the texture. So for instance, I'll do that again and I'll zoom out. So if I grab this here, I can like click a point and it shifts the texture along. And that way you might get the seam of the texture behind the camera so you don't notice it. One thing I am noticing though is these walls in here all should be white. So I can just click on these internal walls. Again, go to my material and then just go default material. And now those internals are white. Oops, I selected something else, so make sure I'm getting just those faces. Default material, and now it's got that white material inside for now. I'm not even sure whether I like this external timber material, but I'll keep working with it for now. So let's go to one of these doors, and I'm going to isolate the door. So ISO, isolate, enter, ZS, zoom in on it. And let's edit our doors. So what I'll do is double click on the door. I'm going to give the door frame the same material. So I'm going to give it that black powder coat, like so. So that's done. The door panel itself, I might leave it as white for now, but I might change my mind later. And then the door handle is another block as well. So if I want to edit that, I then have to I can double click on that handle and I can then materialize it. So I can see I'm selecting each bit individually. And so same deal, right? I could say, all right, I want the handle to be powder coated, but I don't want anything else to be, for instance. Or what I can do, just going back a few steps now. Whoops. Or what I can do is I can just, oops, there you go there. I can just give the entire block of material too. So again, I'll just give the door frame the black powder coat, and I can give the door handle more of a chromatic or chrome finish. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go layer material, and click on a new one, and this time I'm going to click on metals. So I'll click on that, and it's going to ask me, do you want to assign a metal material to the objects inside the block door handle type A? Yes, in that case I do. And when I do that, you can see that is turning into more of like a reflective sort of looking object, okay, like a chromatic object. So when I click on that, we can then edit that material too. So I'll go to metal. So you can see metal is a predetermined material that's already there. And I'm going to go down, we can edit that material. So I'm going to click on the materials tab and then go to, where is it? Are we in here? Metal. So I click on that. I'm going to change that to PM_metal. So it makes sure it's consistent with everything else. And then I'm going to go down to the metal area and change its polish. So at the moment it's quite polished, but if I bring this down to being more rough, you'll notice that the object itself starts to roughen up. So I'll might make it halfway, something like that. And it looks a little bit more like a brushed aluminium. You can add a bump texture if you want as well. So if I do that, you can say, you can add a hatch, a cross hatch, dots, grit, leather, speckle. So maybe grit. And let's see what happens. It's thinking, it's thinking. It's really thinking. There we go. So you can see that gritty sort of texture. It's probably a little bit too hard. Maybe a crosshatch. How does that look? Yeah, that's not too bad. And the scale, you've got so many different types of scales you can choose from in terms of the size of that bump or that bump texture. But I'm relatively happy with that. You can also, I'm sure you'll be able to change the color of it as well. So at the moment it's a silver or a platinum, or whether it's a steel or a titanium, you can see there's predetermined aluminium colors. You could even choose like a copper or a bronze as an example, brass. I think aluminium is what we started with. Chrome is, chrome would have been what we started with, but I'm thinking maybe a stainless steel or a platinum, or even titanium. I think actually works pretty well. So I'll click OK, click OK. That will update the other side of the door as well. So that's now my doors. And if I go show, and I'm going to hide my ceiling, you'll see all those doors that are the same type of block have also been updated. Now notice these doors, the blocks have updated. Okay, so this is a different type of block because these doors are open. So it's the exact same door type, like it's the same size and everything, but it is a different block because these ones are open, these ones are shut. However, they do share the same internal block, which is the door handle. So they have been updated. So keep that in mind. If you have the same block inserted inside of other blocks and you edit it, they'll update in those other blocks. So I'm just going to quickly edit this door, and all I need to do is just change the material to that powder coat. That's now done. Okay. And you can see all the other doors have updated too. So this is just the basics of materials. We've just touched the surface. We'll dive into more detail as appropriate throughout, but at least it will give you a strong basis to start applying materials to architectural items at this point. When we start adding more detail, we've got to add some joinery, then we'll have to materialize the joinery. And then when we start importing external models, we may want to either nab some of those materials and apply them elsewhere in our model, or we may want to completely strip those models of materials and apply our own. To create the camera positions that we're going to use for our renders, we're going to utilize the named view command, as well as using some zoom and some camera tools to get our zoom lens correct. Before I do that, I am going to just quickly material the our topography. And I am going to use this a little bit differently. I'm going to go to my solids layer, and I'm going to click on underneath this little dot here. I'm going to click on this and apply material to the entire layer. So this is a little bit different to before. I'm going to go to custom. I'm going to call this one PM_landscape, and go to my colors, assign texture, and I'm just going to find a grass texture. Doesn't really matter what exactly for now, that will do. Yep, okay, that's now done. And then I'll just quickly change its scale. Okay, something like that. That is fine for now. All right, and then the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change my background. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up my display property. So just type in display properties, find that command, hit enter, and I get this that will appear. And I'm actually going to click on where the little icon is and dock it in my properties window. So my display mode is currently rendered. My background is gradient 2 colors. I'm going to change my gradient to be a light blue, a sky blue. Okay, something like that. Probably too bright, take some of the saturation out. That's pretty good. All right, and I'm also going to make sure my shadowing is turned on, which it is. And I'm going to untick my edges, my curves, so then I don't see any lines. So I just see 3D geometry essentially. All right, so with that done, that's just a quick setup. Let's go into some named views. So the best way to do this is underneath the command, so type in named view, and I already have my palette turned up here in the bottom right hand corner of the screen, and I've docked it, so it's permanently here. But essentially I just orbit to a place in space that I really like. So starting with an external view is probably the easiest. So let's take, say, a view like this, looking up the hill. Okay, something like that. I can save that view by clicking on this little icon, save as, and it's going to ask me to give it a name. So I might call this one exterior 01, and so it saves that view right there. I can then orbit around to the other side, so maybe say something like this, and then I can hit the save icon and save this one as exterior 2 as an example. And so I can, model around, do whatever I'm doing, edit my model, and then just double click on one of these views and it will snap me back to that position. And then we can export these out at a later stage. The other thing I can do is I can also use I can do this internally. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the command zoom lens. So I'm going to type in zoom lens, hit enter, and my cursor turns into this magnifying glass with a plus and minus button. If I click, just left click and drag downwards, my focal length widens versus zooms in versus shortens as I move inwards. You can type in a number if you like, and down the bottom it will tell me what that focal length is. So it's currently 60 mil. I can go zoom lens again, and I might want to go even further out. Now, the reason why you might want to do that is because our internal shots are a little bit easier to get that way. So if I have a shot like, say, something like this, I might go zoom lens and then just scroll out a little bit more so I can fit more of the interior in this shot. So maybe say something like this that looks back on the kitchen and the front door. I could save something like that. So I might go like this and then go, this is interior 1. And the real goal here is to just do as many as possible. So I'll do another one around here, looking back the other way. And in fact, I might do it from, say, like the entrance way as you sort of come into the room. And this might need to be a much wider shot. So I might go zoom lens again, drag that back even more, and then use my mouse to zoom in. Something like that. And let's go interior 2. One tip I will give you is you almost want almost exclusively all your shots to be at eye level. If I want to update these two, so let's say I'm on interior 2 and I'm like, well, actually I need to change my height. I can just, double click on that view to get to it, maybe just pan upwards, and then I can just, with that image selected, and I know it's highlighted, I can just click on Save As and just use the same name, click OK, and it'll ask me if I want to replace it. In this instance, I do. Okay. So I can do the same thing around the front entrance. And if I'm having trouble orbiting around an object, I'll tend to just zoom select around a certain object like this here. And so that's like my entranceway. And I could call this one interior 3. And maybe one out here on the deck, looking internal, inside the building. So something like, what could work? Something like that. We'll call that one an exterior. So I'll go again. This would be exterior 3. And just keep going and just keep creating as many as you can. We'll constantly adjust these, and as we start placing furniture, you'll double click on these and go, oh, okay, I want the furniture to move over here because it's relevant to the camera. Or the other thing may happen, you may go, okay, well, I've got all this furniture here, this camera angle is just not working. But it's always good to get a basis or a basic idea of some of the views you want to utilize for your renders for later on. And especially in the bedrooms, I mean, at this point, it's going to be very hard to ascertain what looks and what works well in a bedroom because we just don't have that detail in there yet. So if I was to, let's say I go into, say, this room here. I mean, you can see if I use zoom lens, I have to zoom out quite far to get the bedroom in. And I can, and that works. That's all good. I'll bring back my ceiling. So it'll end up being something like this. But, I can save that and say, that's interior, is that 4? Interior 4 I'm up to? Yep. But I'm going to have to come back to this later and adjust this once I start putting some furniture in here because it may just not work for the type of view that I'm after. There is no right or wrong here. This is completely up to you which views you want to use, but for the assignment you need 2 interior views and 1 exterior view as a minimum. If you want to do more, you're absolutely welcome to. Alright, so the last command that I'll show you, and you can see at the moment, because I've used my zoom lens so much, it really distorts this view. So in order to get back to the original perspective, I just click on the drop down box here, go to set view, and just click on perspective, and it just goes back to the standard perspective image. Okay. The last one I'll do is I'm going to use something called a section plane tool. So you've got section plane. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut a section through here, or it's like a clipping plane. So I'm going to use the command clipping plane. I'm going to click enter. And then what happens, in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my shaded mode for this. And it's going to ask me to draw a rectangle, essentially. And I'm in the world top view. So if I do that, it's just going to create it somewhere on the floor. So something like that. And it actually doesn't matter too much. But what this object does, it actually slices your model. So you can see it's slicing it like a floor plan. But the other advantage is I can turn this at 90 degrees. And actually I want to slice it the other way, so 180. And I can slice the model in this direction as well. So I can get like a 3D sectional view. I mean, besides the fact we can use this for renders, this is pretty cool to display your models like this if you want to do like a 3D sectional view. But the reason why I've got this here, so this, firstly, this is an object. So it needs to, if I go to my properties, we need to make sure that this object is associated to a layer. So this is the biggest thing that tends to happen with students is they'll create these clipping planes and then they'll lose them. And you'll lose them because they're associated with a layer that isn't separated exclusively for it, and they might accidentally get deleted or removed. So I'm going to create another layer here. I'm going to call this one clipping plane. And I'm going to move this out because I want it to be its own layer, and I'll move it to the top. Okay, clipping plane. And then I will change this to the clipping plane layer, which I have done now. Okay. And I can turn that off so I don't have to see, I can turn that off so I don't have to see the clipping plane. And I can turn it back on so I can click on it and move. So you can see it doesn't matter how big the clipping plane is because it's going to cut everything in the model regardless. But the reason why I have done this is it allows me to get a nice 3D sectional view of the living room, and this is a very popular view, and you see these types of views used commonly in advertising for, like, say, apartments and whatnot. So I'm going to turn this back to my rendered view. Just give that a moment, it's just thinking away. Okay, so something like that, and then I'll turn off my clipping plane so we don't see it. And something like that even is actually really good because when we go to render this, or when we go to take this out, we end up cropping this back. So I might even zoom in, something like this would be fine. And in fact, I think I showed it earlier in the piece, but if we go to the raw renders, you'll see that the raw render from the example looks something like this. So it's just a screen grab of this 3D section, essentially. And when you go and put it into Photoshop and do your final render, you know, you can really get something nice out of it simply by just cropping the image around. But that's how you get like an ultra wide angle, essentially, without, you know, distorting the camera with an ultra wide lens. It's actually just, it is just visually, graphically cheating, but it's basically industry standard. So with that now done, I'm going to give this another interior. So this will be interior 5, and that's now complete. The other thing too is if I go to any other view, so let's say I go back to my exterior 1, that clipping plane disappears because the clipping plane is associated to that interior shot. And you can see interior 5, that image looks like it's just a picture of the solid building, but the clipping plane is associated with that view. So if I go to my interior shot, and even if I like move around, you see there's no clipping plane there. Or if I just go to my exterior shot, no clipping plane. And even if I go back to set view to my original perspective, there's no clipping plane. But as soon as I go down to my interior 5 shot, my clipping plane is associated to it, but it is turned off as a layer so we can't see it. That way it doesn't disrupt the view. If it's on, you'll see it will break up my view. So with that now complete, I have a bunch of good starting points for my interior views and my exterior views. I can keep texturizing away, I can keep editing everything, and you know, these views will just update relative to whatever I do in terms of textures or models, and we can keep utilizing these and keep adjusting them relevant to the objects that we bring in, any materials we choose to use, any finite modeling that we do, and update on the fly. And then we can then eventually we'll choose our shots from here, render those out or save them out, and then bring them into Photoshop for our final render.